Welcome to Pat O'Keefe's World of Curiosities, a podcast where we talk about all things mystical, magical, and mysterious. Hello from high atop an Appalachian mountain. A portal opens to other dimensions. Welcome to Pat O'Keefe's World of Curiosities. Tonight's guest is Alyne Pustanio. And Alyne is a very special person, very gifted, very talented. We're thrilled to have her. She's an author, a paranormal researcher, and an expert in occultism. She is also considered to be an authority in the supernatural folklore and haunted history of her amazingly haunted hometown, New Orleans. Alyne is the author of Haunting Tales of Old New Orleans, History, Legends, and Lore, and the nonfiction, partly biographical, Risks Incidental, Supernatural Dangers of Paranormal Exploration, among many other works. Alyne is frequently sought out as a consultant for television productions and documentaries focusing on supernatural and occult topics, and has been a popular guest on several podcasts and radio shows featuring paranormal subject matter. She is the creator and co host of the popular Supernatural Substation podcast, along with paranormal expert Bernadine Richardson. Together, they have appeared at several pop culture conventions and on a variety of talk shows in their effort to educate others about the supernatural dangers that can result from paranormal investigations and uninformed experimentation with occult practices. Alyne is currently working on the second volume in her Haunting Tales of Old New Orleans series, as well as another nonfiction book that will focus on the many supernatural encounters and hauntings she has experienced in her lifetime. Alyne, welcome to the World of Curiosities.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm curious and a curiosity.
I love it.
2 in 1.
You are my tribe. I-
Yep, and happy Halloween.
and happy Halloween to you and to our listeners. We're thrilled to have everybody that's going to be joining us. And we've already got some comments coming in, which is wonderful. Thank you all
Good.
for being here. And Alyne, we were talking earlier, and people often wonder why some of us are so drawn to the paranormal, to the supernatural. And I think sometimes it's not that we are that interested, at least in the beginning, but that it's interested in us. And so it's like we make this connection. It's kind of a symbiotic one that carries with us through our lifetime. Tell us about how you got involved in doing what you do.
Well, we were talking about how we're Scorpios, so I'm a Scorpio child, but I tend to think that it had, and excuse me, I'm getting over a bronchial infection, so my voice sounds a little honky. I'm not trying to sound sultry or anything, so please bear with me. But I think it's, that it has some connection to the soul we carry as well. The soul that's been with us through different lifetimes has impressions. And, like, for instance, when I was little, I was very Catholic. Family's Catholic. We're all Italians and Spanish, and so we were Catholics, and my grandmothers and all were devout Catholics. But I was very Catholic. I was drawn to the Catholic Church. I was even told by my grandmother that as a little bitty child, I sounded like I was praying in Latin, and I always wanted to like cover my head like a nun. But around 6 years old, 7 years old, these things leave us, and they go into our memories, and then, the only way we can reattach to them is later in life if we have hypnosis, but those imprints stay with you. And so those kind of, I have like what I call a medieval soul, and it resonates to the dark, the gloom, the whole thing of the magic that is that faith in its true form, and then dark things. There's like on YouTube, or not, I'm sorry, on Facebook, what's the first soap opera you started watching? It's always Dark Shadows, right? It's Dark Shadows. From the time I was 6 years old, I mean, it's one of the I ran home. We were planted in front of the TV. I had a Ouija board when I was 5 years old. My mom gave it to me. I have to say that it never really worked for me, and it was like a boring toy. I'd sit there with my cousin, and we'd color on it and do all sorts of things. So we kind of cast that aside. It came back later to haunt us, literally. And then we had other games, and it was just, I had two great grandmothers who were psychics, and that was just like on the peripheral always. And my mother too, she had a real connection to the supernatural as well. So it was just an environment that fosters it. And if you have those imprints, they just resonate with you, and it's like picking up little pieces and you're putting it back together. And you may not even realize it. Not so much, like your personality may be different because we're each different persons, but that soul that you're carrying carries all that memory and what it did in previous lives. So I think that's where it started with me. It was just an echo and an imprint and a background, sort of like a background program continually running. And it's been running ever since. It's just I got in touch with my spooky side early in life. So
But, you mentioned you're a Scorpio, so they do have a tendency, I'm a Scorpio also, we have a tendency to reach out to that, and like I said, I think it's because we experience so much as children that it becomes in some ways commonplace, and we carry that with us. And I loved, we talked just a little bit before we started, you mentioned your mother and that she would take you to lectures. T Tell the audience about your mom and how she, got you into some of this also.
well, my mom and my grandmother, they had sort of a psychic ability, but what it really centered on with my mother, excuse me, when she was 10 years, she was born in 1928. And when she was 10, she was extremely close to her grandfather, her mother's father, and he died in an accident when she was 10 years old in 1938. And throughout her life, as I grew up, she would always talk about wanting to see him again. She was always talking about, what she knew of him and how much she'd like to get in touch with him. And I think that was the root of her interest in pursuing the supernatural and paranormal because in the 70s, there was a lot of people, most know now that the whole ghost hunters, the 90s were not the first explosion of interest in the paranormal. It's been, generations ago, hundreds of years, thousands of years if you count witches and soothsayers and everything. But her interest in the 70s was sparked with Hans Holzer and the Warrens and Sylvia Brown and other researchers and mediums. And there were well, obviously there was the French Quarter, which is a magnet for occultism, bohemianism, the whole lifestyle. But there were also centers like of learning. There were like new age centers where you could go and learn astrology, or learn about divination. And it was just run of the mill. It was like, just everyday stuff. And she would take me there to lectures. I remember seeing Hans Holzer when I was about 10 years old, maybe just about 11. And it was the first time I ever heard anyone talk about the best time to photograph a ghost. And I'm like, here I am in the audience. And he said it's between 2:15 a.m. and about 6:30 in the morning. And when he meant photograph, like we were talking about, he was talking about Polaroid and 35 millimeter and even, what do you call it? Slide film, even back then. And, you push your aperture or you push your speed and everything to try and get it. He explained all that. And my mama got into it. And then he said, you can also record on your regular cassette recorder, you can record the voices of the dead. And this really piqued my mom's interest because of her continual sort of quest to like reconnect with her grandfather. And with an aunt that I had, the aunt was sort of new agey and meditation and yoga and the unity and lotuses and all that kind of stuff. Together, they were kind of a pair, and they would inspire each other to do, different things. And one time I came home from school, Catholic school, so I'm in a uniform. I run inside and I'm looking around my mom. My mom. Now, if you knew my mom, little short Italian New Orleans woman, right? Didn't take anything from anybody. Never, I mean, she was constantly well put together. She's sitting on the floor in her bedroom and she's doing the whole lotus thing and and the and all this. And she looks at me and I'm looking at her. I'm like, "What are you doing? What are you doing sitting on the floor?" And and she was literally meditating, and that was foreign to me. That was like I just never. We grew up in houses where we had little altars, where we had St. Jude, Sacred Heart, the Blessed Mother. We were Italian. We had our little altars in our homes, and we had our rosaries and everything. And one day I came home and Zoroaster was on the altar, and she had removed all of the statues, and there was a lotus candle, and I'm like, "Mom," because I knew her. I'm like, and then things began to happen that were negative, that kinda got out of control, because one thing builds on the other, and once you open any kind of a crack, other things that you don't know about or you can't perceive do find their way in, and in our situation, they did, and they really made our lives miserable for a long time, and she got so scared off of what she was doing that she went all the way past Catholicism, all the way over to born again Christianity, and that's when things in the house and with us really got bad, was when she started going around with, the Bible and trying to drive them out of the house without any kind of authority or knowledge. And even though I was young, I could see, like, there's something wrong here. You're missing some of the pieces, mom. And that's what really piqued me to study it, to not be afraid to look for these books that explained magical rituals or that it talked about demons, demonology, understanding what they were working with, what they were drawing into their lives. Because my mother and my aunt, they had really negative experiences. And I honestly feel that it helped put my mother into an early grave.
Unfortunately, that is a story that I have heard repeated several times within, our community, the paranormal community. One man, was a frequent visitor to a haunted hospital, and unfortunately, some very bad things happened to him, demonic attacks. So it's something that we do see. I'm going to put up your book, the one that talks about yes. There we go. This is yes, and where can people find this book? Because it does delve into this, your own experiences, and I'm sure that you've also researched others' experiences.
It's available on Amazon,
Mhm,
and, I constructed it basically it's for everyone, but it kind of, targets people who are, investigators at the time. That was kind of my focus, but
mhm,
I use real life experiences, to illustrate things that happen because of ignorant psychic experimentation or lack of knowledge about what they were doing. So real life things that happened to me and to some of my family, and then I try to explain that,
mhm,
basically according to supernatural and occult lore. When people say shadow entities, they just sort of that's just so run of the mill now. But in reality, it's one of the most dangerous and evil things that you can actually encounter if you're a paranormal investigator. And a lot of times, people don't take that seriously. Different types of ghosts, different types of hauntings, and how the supernatural is essential to understanding that because Pat, a lot of people that investigate the paranormal, they don't believe in it. A lot of people will say
mhm,
from the outset, I'm a skeptic, I don't believe that. I mean, I'm willing to be convinced. Well, you have to believe that something is there
mhm,
in order to investigate it. You can't go in as a complete non-believer, and
mhm,
they dismiss the most important part, the fact that supernatural reality is objectively real, that these entities
mhm,
exist in their own reality. We can interact with them,
mhm,
and our exposure to them, to whatever degree, a greater or lesser degree, affects us in
mhm,
our daily lives and affects our spirits,
mhm,
and even our souls over time. And so, because they kind of like they want to get from A to C, but they forget B. B is you have to understand the reality of the supernatural in order to be able to investigate it.
mhm.
And luckily, I have a friend, Bernadine LeBlanc, who I'm sorry, that was her previous married name. Going back in time here, Bernadine Richardson, and she believes the same way. So when we became friends, we both sort of made it our mission to, she because she was always like, these people don't know what they're fooling with. They don't understand that this is real. and
Mhm.
we watch it on TV. Now we watch it on TikTok and YouTube, and it's like I wanna pull my hair out.
Mhm.
And they're getting younger and younger going and doing this so-called paranormal investigating or exploration. You just wanna, reach in and just shake them and say, "Stop doing what you're doing," You could ruin your life.
Well, you can. One of the things that worries me, I think even more than that, is the spirituality, connection, if you will, that they're opening doors to other dimensions, and they don't realize that they are a living spirit, and so in that dimension, there's a darkness, and so there's this little tiny light, and what happens when there's a little light? You have everything rushing towards it. And so, without any preparation, without any thought, without any way to protect themselves, they throw themselves into that dimension through that door. And here's what's really sad is that you can often see mental illness starting to develop whenever they do that because it this negative energy will attack in any way that it can, and through our mind, body, and spirit, and our physical body. It's not always about oppression or being possessed, but it can bring, like with your mother, it can bring disease, which can, bring decay and death. So it's something that we have to be very, very aware of. And I'm going to put up your next book, and the reason is because that's what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of our show today. And what I'm excited about is I saw this years ago, and I shouldn't say many, many years ago, but years ago. And I'm like, oh, how absolutely interesting is this person? I just felt your vibe even then. And we've talked on and off. And I remember when you left New Orleans and I saw your new house, you put a picture of it up. And I thought, how absolutely amazing. And you did tell me at the time that you didn't want to have to leave New Orleans, but the violence had gotten so bad that you felt for the safety of your family you needed to. Here's what I found was interesting. I did a little research yesterday, and last year, and this is not the only time that New Orleans has held this title, and it's not a title a city really wants, but it was the number one murder capital of 2023.
Yeah, and they manipulate the data to keep from being that year after year, but it's as dangerous, it's more dangerous than Chicago. It's a different type of danger, and it's so random and so pernicious, it's just out of control. I mean, after Katrina was a bellwether in a lot of ways, and a lot of, infrastructure fell apart, but it's been mismanagement of our city, um, since this we're talking 50 years of mismanagement now. Since way back in the 70s when I was in high school, there was a growing shift away from preserving the culture, keeping, staying in touch with the past and preserving the city. I mean, recently there's everything from people falling into sinkholes in the French Quarter to they had a sewer line explode on Bourbon Street, and you know how if anyone who's visited, they have those grates that you can walk on, and it's to get to the facilities underneath the hotels and all. Well, it was spraying sewage all over Bourbon Street. This was just like 2022. It's a complete just disregard for what keeps a city running, regardless of its music culture and all that. I'm talking about its structural stuff. And Katrina did damage that they have yet to completely address, and they're unable to really do anything about. So, um, I I raised my daughter outside of the city, but then we moved back in there. But yeah, as it began to get a little bit too, the crime was just, it was just not safe. And then she went into the Navy, and I was living there by myself. So that's when I decided to move out. I mean, I love my city. I was just talking the other day with someone. The homes that I grew up down on Broad Street, which is near the fairgrounds where they have the Jazz Fest. That's usually I use festivals to so people can get their bearings. Well, we live down there, and I can't even go see my childhood homes without fear of carjacking, getting shot. So there's that. And that all adds and plays into the spirituality of the city. It's already got a vibe about it. It's got a good vibe, it's got a bad vibe, and then there's crime and everything, and it's contributing to the character, and the breakdown of the character of the city and the spiritual the feeling that people get when they come and they spend time in New Orleans. And unfortunately, crime does that. It does it in any city. And blight and everything else, neighborhoods falling apart and stuff like that. And that has an even a supernatural effect on people that come to visit. But I always say, be careful, that's all. Just be careful. It's not what you think. It's not all ghost tours and, music all the time. It can be dangerous if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So,
One of the things that I know our audience is really interested in tonight are some ghost stories. And you said that you would share with us a few ghost stories that aren't part of the regular tours, maybe your own experiences or experiences of those that you've known. What is your favorite story like that?
oh my gosh, there's uh God, I mean, there's stories that just involve us, but I don't really, I mean, I love everything about New Orleans. I think a lot of people will have one like Marie Laveau, or I kind of focus on the Lalaurie Mansion haunting and Madame Lalaurie because I'm a revisionist when it comes to that. There's been a lot of proof to come out that, a lot of the most extreme stories about Madame Lalaurie and the house itself and the haunting are really fake lore. But I don't like to, kill everybody's buzz. And, I like them to have the hokey, the extreme mythos, and then the reality and make up their own mind. But over the years, and that came from discovering that an ancestor of mine, I'm related on my mother's side to the classical composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk, and he was my great, great, great 6 times, 5 times uncle, and his father, was at the Lalaurie Mansion the day of the fire. He was one of the 3 men, and I didn't know this, although my grandmother, I remembered retroactively that she had spoken about this. He was one of the 3 men who broke down the attic doors, which was supposed to be, the door to the horrors, and he didn't find that. They went the next day, he and a judge, and the other man who was with him, the one of the primary man was Judge Canoge, and he was well known. He was a judge in the civil courts, and he went and gave his statement, and my great uncle, well, Edward Gottschalk witnessed it, and so did the other man, that these were the events. And if you just read it, it's nothing like it's nothing like it's gone into fake lore. But it feeds into the city's myth. Um, it's very popular with tourists and stuff
Mhm,
like that. But we were talking about City Park kind of like randomly when we were
mhm,
just waiting. And City Park, which is down by Bayou St. John, it used to be a plantation. It was just swampland. When Bienville came into New Orleans. He approached it from Lake Pontchartrain, which is to the north, and he came up what is today Bayou St. John. And the earliest spot for burials, he buried some of his dead at the location of Esplanade Avenue and Moss Street, which is today it's called the Park Esplanade. It's condominiums, but underneath there is the oldest burial ground. That was the first burials recorded. Now, the bayou itself ran along what is now City Park, and City Park was the Allard plantation. And eventually it came into the hands of John McDonough, who dedicated it to the city, gave it to the city years later. But one of the enduring myths or stories, ghost stories of City Park is Mona Lisa Drive, and all about the ghost of Mona Lisa. And if you go down there at night, or you go down there on a Halloween, she's walking across the bayou. She comes walking over the water to you and floats up to your car. And it's kind of in that little urban legend area where you got the hook on the car or the knock on the roof. So it kind of fits into that little niche, the stories. But my brother, who's 8 years older than me, um, he was like this, thick as thieves with his cousin, my cousin, who was the same age, close to the same age. And our uncle was the managing pro at the golf courses of City Park, and this was he was there from the 30s all the way into the 80s, into the early 80s, so he was there. He was, foundation. He was like a cornerstone. Well, he would go around to the different courses because they had 4 operable courses and they had a driving range, and so my brother and Trudy, my brother's name is Al, and my cousin Trudy, they'd ride with him in the golf cart and they'd go all around. Well, one of the courses, the Old North course, was close to the area where allegedly Mona Lisa Drive was. And while Uncle Eddie was doing his thing, checking in, going in whatever he was doing, my brother and Trudy, they walked off and they went walking up into the woods. And they were walking along a bayou in the back, and it was getting near the end of the day. So the light was going down and it gets darker under the trees sooner. And they were walking along one side of the bayou, throwing rocks, trying to get in trouble. And they saw a woman walking along sort of like parallel with them, but on the opposite side of the lagoon. And she was coming around as they were going that way. And it was just, they got the hair on their arms, just stood on end. Trudy got scared, grabbed him. We got to go. And right about that time, she walked out onto the water, and she was glowing now in the I'm hiding my camera. She was glowing now in the dark, the lengthening gloom, but she was coming toward them. And so they hurried up and they ran and they got behind like a bunch of trees that had fallen over, and they were scared and they were clutching each other. They were screaming. They were about to scream, and then all of a sudden they heard, "What are you doing there? Get up from there." My uncle had driven up on the golf cart and my cousin passed out. They had to, like, revive her a little bit. They jumped in the golf cart and were clinging on. He's like, "I told you not to go. I told you not to go wandering off. They got ghosts in this woods." Well, as soon as he had shown up, obviously, the spirit had dissipated, but they really did see the ghost of Mona Lisa. Now, who Mona Lisa is, there's different stories. They say that she's a daughter of the owner of the Allard plantation who wanted to marry, but her father wouldn't approve, and so she drowned herself in the lagoon. There's another story that says she is the daughter of a philanthropist who gave a lot of money to City Park and erected a statue for her. And there was a statue put up, I think, right at the beginning of the WPA projects in New Orleans that was in a little cul-de-sac that you had to go way up into the thing, and they had a lagoon running along the back of it, and that statue was there until somebody, um, daredevil, whatever, was doing wheelies and knocked the statue down. And they say that that's when the haunting started, and that was like in the 50s. So there's that story, and then there's a story of a jilted lover. There's always a jilted lover, and she was jilted by a sailor, wandered into City Park, got lost, and drowned in the bayous. But regardless of really who it is a real ghost. Now, interestingly enough, I did some research, and in the days when it was still, golf courses, but it was still a park, an open park, there was hunting allowed in there. Men could go in there, you could go, or men and women, you could go, and while people were golfing, this is New Orleans, right? People golfing, people with guns, hunting, and one time on the I think it was the 18th hole, I don't know if it was exactly the 18th hole, but it was the one closest to that came around on the north course closest to the clubhouse. A woman was shot, and there's pictures in the paper of my uncle there on the green with the body covered up. Now, where she was shot is near where Mona Lisa is said to haunt, and she also moves and comes into the middle of the interstate. And there are stories of people who have wrecked their cars because they see the ghost of a woman standing in the middle of the 610 exchange, which is going to join the rest of the I-10, right in the middle. And that was where she was shot. That was where the old green was. So those are some stories that, are just part of our lore, that any of that could be true in New
Full,
Orleans.
and I have been there, of course, like everyone who goes to, New Orleans with my kind of, desire to see all things haunted and saw the beautiful building. and it was owned by Nicolas Cage at the time, and it's really interesting when you look at the history of the Lalaurie mansion. Everyone who has bought it has suffered absolute financial devastation, and the last one was Nicolas Cage. And if you go to New Orleans in St. Louis number 1, that's the cemetery, he has a monument to himself, for when he passes that is in the shape of a pyramid, which is really interesting. But if you look just within the gates of that building, it is beautiful. I don't know if it was already there as part of the motif, but it's an ancient Egyptian type of motif, which I thought was interesting since what he has chosen is a pyramid to be buried underneath. And for those of us that know anything about, about shapes and geometrics, what they call sacred geometry, it works as a point when you think about it, and it brings energy down into that. So it makes me wonder if, exactly what he has in mind for this, but it's really interesting, and this is not a cheap monument. It's in a very, very expensive place, if you can even get a plot there now. I don't know if that's possible, but St. Louis number 1 is also where Marie Laveau is buried.
He, his tomb is so white, Jesus can see it now, okay? He doesn't have to come. This tomb, Marie Laveau is here, and you're standing there, or what they say it's her tomb. I am in the camp based on what I know that she's not in there, but that's me. There she is. You look over here and you kinda, excuse me. Okay, Marie, take a right, and there he is. Big old white. And the way that he got it was there was another tomb, excuse me, that had fallen into disrepair, and they were gonna tear it down. It was just bricks, a pile of bricks, and he was able to buy it. So he bought it, built his tomb. It has some weird, I don't know, Ox Omnia or something written on it. And I was in the, I'm so sorry. Um, no, it's so embarrassing. But I was in there. Actually, I was with the Booth brothers, and they were filming, taking pictures of Marie Laveau's tomb. And I walked a little ways because it was the first opportunity I had to see the Nick Cage tomb. And I was just standing there. Everybody just kind of stands there. There it is. And this tourist came up to me, and Hawaiian shirt, shorts, fanny pack, fedora, the whole thing. And he's standing there and he's looking at me, looking at the tomb. And I look up at him and he's like, "Whose tomb is that?" I said, "It's Nick Cage's tomb." And he says, "Is he in there?" And I'm like, "I don't think so. I mean, I don't know." And I went up to it and I knocked on it and it was hollow. I said, "No, as a matter of fact, he's still alive. He's not in there yet, unless he's sitting in there." But I didn't think so. So I did that. And there's a story attached to that too. And sorry, part of the Halloween horrors is me coughing in everybody's ear. But there was a girl. Now you don't do this. This was years ago. You don't walk. You're not walking along on the side of the wall by the by St. Louis number 1 very often if you're smart these days. But there was a girl who was taking a bus, who got off a bus after work and was walking along past the cemetery wall, and there she was. Suddenly, somebody jumped over the wall in front of her. So she was gonna run. She was scared. She screamed because they were there. He turned around, it was Nick Cage. And he said to this woman, he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." He said, "I was just in there admiring my tomb." So, okay. And then he says to her, "Do you wanna see it?" This is a true story because I heard it from the people, from the person it happened to. "Do you wanna see it?" He boosted her up over the wall, and he went back in the graveyard with her, and he showed her his tomb, and he showed her all around, and then he boosted her back over, and they went and had drinks, and, that was that. That's a Nick Cage story. Like, he fell in love with this city. Now, I heard you talking about the house itself, and some of the things that have happened. Excuse me. I don't know that there's a curse on it, but when people say that she haunts there, meaning by she, Madame LaLaurie, I always say no. I doubt very much that she haunts there because she was very unhappy in that house. Um, she was 8 to 10 years older than Dr. LaLaurie when they lived there, and there was a lot of controversy about the house even from the very beginning. It it was already under construction when she and he bought it in something like 1831, I think, and, she was immediately embroiled in a disagreement or a dispute with her cousin who wanted that property too, and apparently at some point had been thought he had been promised it. So they were fighting from the very beginning. She got it, but that left one very angry cousin. And from the very beginning, there was just controversy, disputes. The house looks nothing like it did when she finished it, when they finished it, because there is no roof. In originally is a was a red brick house, and today it's cinder blocks, but it was red brick and it had a huge hip roof, which is the big tall roof with 6 gables with 3 facing royal and 3 facing behind. And that was the attics that burnt down. So what you see today where there's a turret, that was the original floor of the attic. And in Creole houses, you didn't live on the ground floor. You did your business on the ground floor. You received deliveries on the ground floor for your kitchens, your stores and everything. And in her day, if you were her, you did your entertaining as well. So there was a huge room for ballroom dancing, for all of these receptions and soirees and tour de salons and all these things that she hosted, and that was mostly done on the ground floor of the Creole home. So the next story up was the living quarters, then the bedrooms, then the attics. Now, he was a doctor, and no, everybody just skates right over. He was a doctor. And according to my uncle, or the witness of my great great great, they found in the attic that day, after being blocked on the stairs by Dr. Lalaurie from going up to the attics for whatever reason, they found 3 male slaves, chained, 3, and they were chained in a way that they were standing, so they weren't, like, chained against walls. There was an elderly black man and an elderly black woman, and the woman, the man, I'm sorry, had what would be the equivalent of a straitjacket on. He also had an open wound on his head with maggots in it. Now, this is 1834, so and the woman was being treated for other sort of physical, like skin maladies. That was it. There were 3, 5. 5 were found and brought down. There was a cook and her assistant, like a maid, so that's 5, 6, 7. 7, that's it. That's all that were taken out of the house. The old man's wound was being treated with maggots because it was infected. Um, the woman was also being treated by the doctor. The only gray area is the 3 male slaves. Nobody knows what was going on. There are, suggestions that the doctor was gay, that he was bisexual, that was his thing and that's what he was doing, because after he tried to stop everybody going up the stairs, he ran away. So he left this woman, and their young son, who was about 6 years old, to deal with a mob that was about ready to tear the house down, because they had been wanting to tear houses down because it was sort of that, I don't know, that kind of, let's tear everything down, mentality, because they were on their way to go tear down 2 more houses and they had to call the army out. It was just a mob that grew on itself. But Madame LaLaurie was the equivalent of Bill Gates money. I'm talking Elon Musk type rich, relative to the citizens of New Orleans. Her family was money, and people resented her for that, and they were very much in the courts all the time over estates and properties, and were always so they didn't like her. She was rich. They didn't understand her. They, looked on her that way. So she was mobbed, and there was a man, Bastien, who was her her footman, actually to her, or a valet. He was the one who rescued her and got her out in a carriage with her son and her 2 daughters. And, there's so many little idiosyncrasies. There's, like, little grains of information that when you look back on, one of her daughters had scoliosis of the spine. They said they brought torture instruments out of the house and put them in the street, in Royal Street. Well, he had been, Dr. Lalaurie, he wanted to be an orthopedic specialist, and he had been treating the daughter who had the curved spine with these things that look like Victorian torture instruments, but it was to stretch the spine and to exercise the spine. And there they are in the middle of Royal Street, and people said, "They're tormenting the slaves with these things. They're terrible people." And now every day, 364 days a year, the story's told again and again and again in front of that house. So, is it a happy house? No, it's not. It's not a happy house. It went from being a house, where people lived. She left. They went to Paris. A whole story we could tell another time. But it went into fell into disrepair. It became derelict. Then it became the first integrated girls' school in the South. That didn't last long. Then it became a music school. Then when the Italians started to come in near the end of the 1800s, it became part of that neighborhood. It became a bar, and then they turned the upstairs into apartments. And so that's to say hundreds of people went through there after her. So all of the things that are attributed just to her and just to that time period, those ghosts, and it has to be that, it's it's not. It cannot be because there's just so much more humanity that went through the house. In the 1980s, it was restored, and a friend of mine it was restored by 2 physicians, and a friend of mine helped them when they were finally moving to another house, helped them pack in an area where they had kept all their medical journals and their medical books and everything in an area that they didn't use of the house. She was alone in there packing all that up, turned around and saw the ghost of Dr. Lalaurie. He was there. Madame Lalaurie, not so much. The only other ghosts that those men were aware of were little girls that were ghosts from the era when it was a girls' school, and they would run around the fountain laughing and cutting up, but nobody hears these stories. Even there are books that, there's a couple of books that kind of came close, but nobody really hears these stories, so they don't attach any humanity to the story of Delphine Lalaurie. She was not the monster. I mean, this was 1834, 33. You know how much clothes women wore, like, for an evening? Yards and yards and yards of satin silk, especially a woman like that, and this little petite 4'11" woman is supposed to have chased a little girl who was got a knot in her hair. She got so mad, she chased her out onto the roof and beat her with a whip in 90 yards of, satin, um, where there's a hip roof and you can't get around it. Well, that story, and allegedly the girl was beaten, she fell down into the courtyard and was buried under the bricks in the middle of the night. The woman who made that accusation was her cousin's wife, who hated her and made it up while all of this stuff was going on, and went into court and retracted that and said it never happened. But every day they stand in front of that house and they say that. They even gave a name to the slave girl, so it's an unhappy place. I don't think anybody could really be 100% happy, and it does get changed hands a lot. It just recently got resold.
Mhm.
But
Yeah,
is it
the
because of the
last time that
story?
it was resold, I saw it was Nick Cage, it was $10,000,000 unless the next people, had actually sold it, but he did, he did go financially, bankrupt. That was part
Mhm.
of it, and that was part of the, estate auction, if you will, to pay those debts,
Yeah,
which I
he
find
did lose it.
he did. He lost it, and then if you look at the history, there have been others that have had fortunes that have lost it, including the Lalauries, because they did have to leave New Orleans, and,
Yep,
although
they
the
actually did.
And they left what they had there, behind, because like you said, when you get a mob mentality, no matter what it is about, it becomes deadly, and of course, she did. I mean, by all accounts, she did flee into the night, and, of course, there are rumors, and I know you're well read on this, that, she had been caught and that she had been, summarily, executed, that
No.
sort of thing, but the evidence points to an escape to Europe, does it not?
She, the Bastian got her and her son and the 2 girls, now she has 2 older daughters too who had married well in the city. Um, they're elsewhere. They got into the carriage and they went up what was the old Bayou Road, which connects to Esplanade and goes right down to the bayou. The place I told you about in the beginning where the earliest burials were, well, it was right there. And that was the area known as the Spanish Docks. And on my father's side of the family, and that's near, yeah, that's Metairie Cemetery. On
Mhm,
my father's side of the family, the Planuses ran the Spanish docks there. So she went, and it was by this time nightfall. She went down there and stayed with Mayor Pito. I don't, he wasn't the mayor then, but I think he was a former mayor. He had a home there, and the house is still there, the Pito house. You can go tour it. She took refuge there, and our family, or the Planuses, got her a boat, secured a boat for her to take her up the Bayou St. John, across the lake to a place which is about 20 minutes away from me on the shore of Lake Pontchartrain, to a home called the Coquille Home, and it still bears the same name. Now, there, her husband, who had left her and to all of this, came creeping back and joined her there after everything settled down. They divided their assets, their immovable assets, their money between. She signed her power of attorney over to the husband of her eldest daughter Borquita, and he signed his power of attorney over to the husband of her second eldest daughter, because they were half sisters, because Lalaurie was married one, two, three times. So that was the first and second husband. But he was friends with that husband and he was comfortable with signing all of his stuff. And then they took boat and they went to Mobile, they went to Havana, and then they went to France. And she did not come back here. They found a plaque which acknowledged the fact that she had died in Paris, and it was on, I think, the Forstall tomb in St. Louis number 1, and she is buried, according to a couple of authors who did their work, she's buried in Villeneuve-sur-Lot, France, in the Lalaurie graves, wherever. One day I hope I'll go there, but she's buried in the city where, or the town where he came from. So she's buried among people she hated. Basically, she just did not get along with her in-laws once she got there. But she didn't stay with them. She lived in Paris for a time because she had wealthy aunts and people who had already gone on to the continent, and she just basically followed. But this whole thing about she came back and everything, she is really, Pat, one of the most maligned people in New Orleans history. And it's a big part of it is just looking at it through the lens of the time that she lived in, which was slavery was a
mhm,
reality
mhm,
and the property was a reality. And they tend to
mhm,
lump it in. But one thing, it's not defensible in any way,
mhm,
but the slaves of New Orleans, the Creole slaves, were looked upon by the Creoles as their family. They had enormous latitude. They could come and go as they pleased. They could even leave town for a little bit and come back. They lived in beautiful homes in the French Quarter and all around the city. They were protected by the people who owned them. They sometimes took their names. They raised their children right along with their little children. And when they died, the Creole families went up against the Catholic Church trying to have their slaves, their family,
mhm,
people that they looked on as their family now, buried with them,
mhm,
primarily in St. Louis number 1, which was the main cemetery. And because they would not let blacks be buried with whites, or mixed race, free people of color even could not be buried with whites. And this persisted until after the Civil War. They started St. Louis number 2 cemetery. So that whole cemetery began because those Creoles wanted what they considered their extended family and their family who had been with them all their lives to be buried with them. So since they couldn't be with them, they put them as close as possible and founded a whole new cemetery. So we get a lot of bad rap because of obviously the horror of slavery. And in the plantations out away from the city, there are things that happen because they're, the owners were judge, juror, and executioner, and that's just how they were. A lot of them, most of them were not Christians. Most of them
Mhm.
were not Christians. And there were a lot of free blacks who owned the slaves on those plantations. Those were bad things. I mean, those were not a good place to be. But in New Orleans, it was a unique atmosphere, just like New Orleans is unique today for
Mhm.
a number of reasons. It was
Mhm.
unique among American cities because that's the way that they treated that was the manner of the Creoles. They were, just effacious and inclusive, and they were just that way. And they included everyone. They were one big family. So
Let
people get that wrong a lot. And so they look at her through that lens and they say, well, she's terrible. She's the most horrible woman that ever lived. Really, her husband was worse than she was.
Well, let me mention too, it wasn't just about race as far as how you would be treated in terms of cemeteries. There were times that a Catholic cemetery would not inter, say, a Methodist. And I've actually seen a
Yeah.
grave where the husband is on one side of the fence and
Hmm.
yes, and the wife is on the other. And they actually have a monument that goes right up against the fence and they're holding hands. I mean, it's a
Yes, I've
beautiful
seen
monument.
that
Yes,
through
well,
the yeah,
so it also had to do with religion. Anything that wasn't of whoever was in charge, in this case, in
right.
charge of the cemetery. When you're the other, especially at different times in history, it could cost you everything. And
Mhm.
it's really interesting that you mentioned this was 1834 because there was another 30 years before the end of the Civil War. So there was definitely, I mean, slavery was unfortunately a reality of life especially in the South. And you're right that there were different people who may have treated those who were enslaved better, but
Oh, well, yeah, I
but
mean, if you have that kinda discussion, of co
mhm,
obviously, because, I mean, we fell in the Civil War, we fell early. New Orleans fell early. So when the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, this is not supernatural, but when it was issued, at the end of 1862, early 1863, the slaves in New Orleans were not free. They were not freed until after the war, until the celebration of the Juneteenth, is connected to that time when New Orleans's slave population, the enslaved, were finally emancipated because they were federal. They were considered part of the Union, and they suffered through the Civil War, or I say suffered, but they continued on living. With the hot-blooded Creoles who didn't like the Union, in the city throughout the Civil War. But the persistence of racism and separatism and all, yeah, there's no way to deny that that continued. That continued, but it's when people accuse New Orleans of it, they have to understand it really was less here. The way that people are sort of, laissez-faire kind of down here, and some of the things that they love about us is our laissez-faire attitude toward life. They were like that. That's how we got that reputation. It was from the Creoles, the New World Creoles, who were like, sharing the abundance of their life and included everybody. And so it's a myth that they mistreated their slaves. There were rules. I mean, obviously there were exceptions to every rules, but it is a myth because you wouldn't have a Marie Laveau if that kind of atmosphere prevailed. Marie Laveau was sought after by whites, free blacks, Indians. She went across all strata, and she is still remembered today, not because she was a black woman who could do that, but because she was so respected across the strata of New Orleans. Women from all ranks looked on her as worthy, valuable, someone to seek out for counsel, for help, and you wouldn't have her. But remembering now what I said about St. Louis number 1, and people always wanna prove me wrong and say that that grave The plaque says it's alleged to be, or it's reputedly, the last resting place, and I'm gonna leave it at that, okay, because Marie Laveau was not white, so, and everybody goes, she's in there," and they wanna argue, but okay, that's fine. You can't get to the grave now since somebody painted it pink. There was a man who thought, sort of he was yeah, this was, oh, several years ago now, maybe 10 years. There was a man who was mentally unstable, but he wanted to do he was in St. Louis number 1 and saw the markings and everything that was all over the tomb, and he wanted to do something to improve it, and clean it up, and unfortunately, the paint he picked was a Pepto-Bismol pink, pink, and it was acrylic, I think, or yeah, well, it seeped into the old plaster of the tomb so that it went into layers and layers, and the archdiocese, who runs all of the Catholic cemeteries, it cost them over $10,000 to refurbish the tomb, and that's still a family tomb for a family here, and they still bury their dead in that tomb when they have to, and so that incident is what got St. Louis shut down to random tourists. You either need to be in a tour group with a licensed tour guide or be prove that you are family and you're in for a funeral or you're visiting your family's grave. So it's locked now. Oh, I have stories from the seedier side of town. There's a couple in my book. I mean, if you haunting tales, there are stories in there. The stories that I write have a kernel of truth in it. They're in. I talk about the woman who is haunting Lafitte's blacksmith shop. I talk about the zombie king of New Orleans who was real. He was also written about by my ancestor, Louis Morogachok. So the story comes from that. I talk about the magic and the of the slaves of the Isleños and the swamp golems they used to make. They created stone golems that came to life in the swamp for real. And so my stories are based on actual um, legends that are not told and the solutions to some curious questions that people have about some of our myths. The next volume is going to be Under a Creole Moon, and it's going to be stories from the Creoles. So the supernatural creatures that came from their culture.
I love that you've shared so much with us tonight. I am going to put the other book up because Tracy had requested this. Both books can be found on Amazon and other online bookstores. I'm sure we appreciate you so much. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in tonight, and also like to thank tonight's guest, Alyne Pustanio. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm butchering it. Oh, okay. For graciously being with us and sharing her wealth of knowledge of ghosts of New Orleans and more. And also, is there anything that you would like for them to know, like how they can get in touch with you?
Well, I am on Facebook. You can just find me on Facebook. We also with Bernadine Richardson, I do the Supernatural Substation. We have a YouTube channel and we're trying to build it up. We only have a few subscribers. I'm about to do our Halloween upload, but you can reach us through there. If you need a paranormal investigation, you can contact Bernadine through there or through Facebook. But we're in most of the usual spots. All my books are on Amazon. It's just easy that way, and you can find them there, or if you want to contact me on Facebook, that's fine. And I do answer questions, like random questions and stuff like that, that people have, so about the supernatural, paranormal, whatever.
All right. We are going to end with a good note. Tracy says, thank you for visiting us. Both of your books look amazing. You have a new fan. Hope you feel better soon. And from the mountaintop in Appalachia, we say adieu. We return from that portal into the world of reality, only to return next week on Thursday night at our regular time of 8 p.m. Good night.